This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Former United Nations Chief Kofi Annan has died. The top world diplomat passed away on Saturday in the Swiss city of Geneva, which according to his family followed a short ailment. In a career spanning over 40 years at the United Nations, Mr. Annan finished his term at the UN as the 7th Secretary General of the world's top governing body, with his 8-year tenure marked by both triumphs and challenges. Tonight, we look back at the highlights of Kofi Annan's work and times. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to the special edition of Talk Africa live from Nairobi. Remembered for his ability to lead and inspire, Kofi Annan emphasized the power of individual action in addressing global challenges. He served 2 terms as UN chief from 1997 to 2006 and was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work. The Organization of the Elders, where he served as chairperson, today highlighted his work to unceasingly improve the lives of millions of people around the world. Our reporter Tuli Shabalala takes a look back at Mr. Annan's lifelong work for the years.
Described as a global statesman, deeply committed to a fair and peaceful world.
Sadly, once again, the biggest challenge comes from Africa, from Darfur, where the continuous spectacle of men and women and children driven from their homes by murder, rape, and burning of their villages makes a mockery of our claim as an international community to shield people from the worst abuses.
Kofi Annan was born in Kumasi in Ghana on 8 April 1938, the son of a provincial governor and grandson of 2 tribal chiefs. Annan joined the UN in Geneva in 1962 as an administrative and budget officer with the World Health Organization. He came up through the ranks and was the first black African to be appointed the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations. He served as the world's top diplomat from 1997 to 2006. He served the UN at some of the most difficult times, the Iraqi war and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Annan was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian work in 2001. He's acknowledged for revitalizing the UN, an advocate for human rights, the Millennium Development Goals and Africa.
I depart convinced that today's United Nations does more than ever before. It does it better than ever before. Yet, our work is far from complete. Indeed, it will never be. It falls to my successor to carry forward the UN's valuable mission. From the contacts I've had with him, I already know that you have chosen well.
He later served as the UN Special Envoy for Syria and continued his work on peace and development and human rights through the Kofi Annan Foundation. He joined the Elders, an elite group of former leaders founded by Nelson Mandela. On Saturday, the 18th of August 2018, when the news of his death spread, tributes from all over the world poured in. Current UN Chief Antonio Guterres has described Annan as a guiding force for good. Ghana's government says from Monday, its national flag will fly at half-mast across the country and in all its diplomatic missions across the world to honor Annan. Kofi Annan is survived by his second wife Nane and 3 children. Tuli Shabalala, CGTN.
In 2012, I caught up with Mr. Annan in Arusha, Tanzania. The global statesman talked about a wide range of issues that still resonate today, including transparency of Africa's economies, the continent's electoral processes, and the quest for global peace. Here are excerpts from that interview.
I think Africa is definitely the next frontier, and lots of important investors and countries are looking at Africa. But it is not enough for them to look at Africa. We should have the right policies, the right regulatory systems. We should ensure that the money we get from natural resources, extraction of gold, diamonds, and oil, is transferred into development for our people. We need to insist on a transparent process. The US is pushing companies to transparently put out the amounts of money they pay to governments, not just at the national level, but at the project level, so that a community will know what contribution their community made to the national coffers. European Union is going to go through with the same bill, but the African governments must also pass a bill and say, we will make these figures transparent. We will let our population know how much we got for the oil, how we used it for, how it's benefiting the people, and that transparency will put so much energy in our economy that it will push us further much faster than we realize.
But you have talked about Africa's poor quality, though, poor quality in leadership as being perhaps a risk factor in squandering Africa's gains. What are the yardsticks of good quality?
First of all, you have to start by accepting that the government has responsibility for the welfare of its people, and has to take steps to ensure that not only do they have good health system, good education to prepare them for the future. I've always maintained that governments have to understand that a healthy society, a healthy, balanced society has to be built on 3 pillars, and these are areas that I would want to see governments focus on. The first is stability, peace and stability. The second is development, because you cannot have development without stability, and you cannot have long-term stability without development. But these two have to be rooted firmly in respect for rule of law and human rights. And often it's the third pillar that causes us problems. Our leaders conveniently forget that third pillar because it's not convenient to them, but it's not a matter of convenience. If you don't focus on that third pillar of rule of law and respect for human rights, you're building on sand. And that explains to some extent the difficulties we saw in North Africa and in Middle East. Everybody thought Tunisia, for example, was doing extremely well. Economically, it was stable, but they never talked about the third pillar, and we saw what happened.
How do you rate Africa's leadership, though?
How do I rate Africa's leadership?
Yes.
I will start by saying that there are some leaders who have done well. There are many who have overstayed. I really believe that any leader who has done more than 2 terms, or at least 3, should begin looking around and thinking of his or her future. Because if they continue and insist on sticking around, they will going to have troubles. The population will demand change. And this is why we have all opted for democracy and for democratic rotation of leadership. So some have done well, others have been problematic. But what gives me hope is the development of active civil society and the young generation that I've referred to. Civil society has the capacity of putting fire under the politicians, of holding them accountable. And this is why elections with integrity is so important. If you have elections with integrity, the leader has legitimacy and the losers are protected. And the people are confident they have a say in their government. Otherwise, they become cynical and they lose interest in government and in the politicians. So we need the institutions, we need to respect these principles and let them guide us.
Well, there have been, most African countries, though, have gone through the electoral process over the last 2 decades. And as you have said before, though, that much of Africa's progress in the last decade risks being squandered or reversed by the winner-take-it-all approach.
Yeah, I don't think the coalition government approach is a solution for every country or for every situation. There have been lots of elections which have been a veneer to give the leader a false respectability, when in fact the elections were not true elections at all and were rigged. And those are the situations which often causes problems. But if it's election with integrity, which is transparent, accountable, open playing field, then the results and the elections itself are accepted generally, and the leader has legitimacy.
In terms of economic change, though, in terms of the good economic prospects, what do you see have been some of the factors that have propelled Africa to where it is today?
First of all, there's better governance, better macroeconomic policies in quite a few of the countries. Secondly, you have other new players on the ground. You have the emerging markets, China, Brazil, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, others also coming to the continent to invest, in addition to the traditional investors and donors from the West. We also have another development. We have young, educated, hungry men and women who want to get on with their lives, who want to see improvements in their societies. Some have been educated and worked in the United States, in Europe, Asia, and are coming back. And they are going to make a difference.
What do you see, though, as the impact of the emerging economies in Africa, emerging countries in Africa, like the BRICS and like China? What do you see the impact of that on Africa's political development, for instance, not just the economy?
No, I think it's been generally positive. I mean, there are aspects of it that we can argue about, but it's been generally positive. And quite a few of them have experiences which are relevant to the situations we are living in and the issues we are trying to deal with. So my attitude is we should deal with them. I'm happy we are dealing with them, but we should look after our own interests. Nobody is going to do it for us. We should not point fingers. We should look after ourselves.
Well, Talk Africa takes a short break now. When we come back, we'll take a closer look at the legacy of Kofi Annan with my expert panel of guests. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms, and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. I'm now joined by Ambassador Erastus Mwencha. He's a former deputy chairperson of the African Union Commission, and Ambassador Boaz Mbaya. He's a former Kenyan ambassador to the African Union. To you both, thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. Ambassador Mwencha, let me start off with you, because you and Secretary General Antonio Guterres today described the late Kofi Annan as a guiding force for good. His foundation issued a statement describing him as a global statesman and deeply committed internationalist who fought throughout his life for a fairer and a more peaceful world. Both of you have been diplomats at the African Union. First, your sentiments on those issues.
Truly, Kofi Annan was a global statesperson and one that inspired many people. And his leadership qualities were exemplary. A very charming person, and one that has deep interests, particularly in the area of equity, in the area of peace, and also on progress. He broke glass ceilings in many ways because first, he was the first black African to be elected as UN Secretary General. And of course, at a very difficult time, because remember when he was elected, it was a very difficult moment when Boutros Ghali failed to secure his second term. And even when he served, people thought that he was only going to be able to serve for one term because that would have been Africa's turn. But because of his exemplary leadership, he secured that second term, meaning Africa was able to have an unprecedented leadership of the UN for 15 years.
When you talk about he believed in equity and fairness, so during his term at the United Nations, did the world see a more equitable distribution? Did the world see a more fair world under his leadership?
One of the things that he launched during his time was the Millennium Development Goals. And in the Millennium Development Goals, of course, one of the fundamental points was to say we must all live together in the world and address the common challenges that we have. It was able to link peace and progress as a very close nexus. Beyond that, of course, he also was able to look into specific areas of where countries had challenges, particularly in ways in which remember he mentioned at one time that as a world, we have the capacity and the means to overcome challenges that face us if only we can summon up our common will, political will.
Let me get your thoughts, though, Ambassador Mbaya, because Kofi Annan spent most of his life at the United Nations. For you, though, as a diplomat, what stood out about his works at the UN?
First of all, I would like to begin by saying that he's a son of Africa. He was a son of Africa. But his statesmanship transcended the boundaries of Africa into world leadership. And as a world leader, he was concerned not just with African problems, but with the problems of the world over. Now, it is interesting that Kofi Annan, although he grew up through the UN system, was able to make certain initiatives like what Ambassador Mwencha has referred to in terms of Millennium Development Goals, takes those initiatives to push to member states for them to adopt so that the world begins to develop areas that had not been developed as quickly as possible. And it was not an easy task because he was carrying out the mandate of member states who are his employers. And as a public international servant, he had to go by the whims of his employers. But he was able to manage and also advise that the best way to do so is to make the world equitable.
But the one thing that many will be asking, though, because he won a Nobel Peace Prize, though, did he leave the United Nations in a better shape than he found it?
International politics is very difficult. Multilateral diplomacy is even more difficult in terms of what you're able to say, yes, I achieved this or I did not achieve that. But I think he made the world debate the issues much more than had been the case before. Take the case of United Nations reforms. Kofi Annan took it up with a lot of zeal. United Nations reforms were not a new thing when he came when he became Secretary General. It's something that started immediately after the organization had been established to try and balance, particularly the power of the veto from predominantly Western world to across the world. And the world has changed in terms of demographics as well as economic performance. There are countries in the developing countries that were colonies before, but they're now very, very important economic powers. So he was able to, I think, advance that debate. Whether it is going to be achieved, we don't know, because that depends on the big powers themselves.
Let me bring it closer home to Africa, because he was heading the peacekeeping unit in early 1990s, though, and some of the issues that have come up, though, include Somalia, and what stands to mind for Africa, though, is the Rwandan genocide, in which Kofi Annan himself had expressed at some stage in 2004 regret at the way Rwanda ended up. Was he too harsh on himself?
I think he's being honest in judging himself, because if you look at the general who was then managing the UN forces in Rwanda, he does, of course, indicate that if Kofi Annan had given permission for him to get access to the ammunition, the genocide against the Tutsi wouldn't have been as bad as it was. And I think that is the true statesman, that he would be able to acknowledge the challenges that he faced and not merely reflect on the triumphs that he was able to achieve in his life. And for the case of Somalia, this was perhaps a very challenging mission, even for the UN. You remember that the US pulled out because they came in without any exit strategy, they came in without any tactics, and they left with him a very difficult situation. But of course, during Kofi Annan, Somalia was stabilized, and now Somalia is on its way to peace, of course, with the new challenges that has emerged. But of course, you reflected on those 2 points. I would like to bring in particularly the case of Kenya. Although it came after he had just left his position, I can say for sure, because I worked very closely with him on this issue, and I know that he did a lot to save the peace situation in Kenya, and without him, perhaps, Kenya would have plunged itself to a very serious condition.
It reflect for us, though, Ambassador Mbaya, reflect for us some of the issues that he dealt with on the African continent, because peace and security are very much at the core of the African Union as well, of the United Nations, and Kofi Annan had called for more effort to ending the conflicts in Africa. Reflect for us on that.
First of all, just to add a bit of a point on what Ambassador Mwencha said, the United Nations goes into situations with a specific mandates. And I don't think Kofi Annan was, as an individual, whether he was a Secretary General or a Deputy Secretary General, able to change that mandate unless the Security Council itself had changed that mandate. So his hands were tied, and we cannot blame Kofi Annan as Kofi Annan. But to come back to the specific issues that you're referring to, Kofi Annan was concerned with peace everywhere on the continent, and he saw peace as a way in which Africa would develop if it attained peaceful resolution of all the conflicts. We had conflicts in West Africa, we had conflicts in the Great Lakes region, we had conflicts in the Horn of Africa, and all those were subjects for discussion at the United Nations Security Council. And Kofi Annan, being the Secretary General, was the person reporting to the Security Council about what developments and what other complications may have arisen or would arise to involve the international community. So he cannot be singled out for any particular one, but he was interested in peace across the country.
Do you find, though, that African issues and African thoughts fared better at the United Nations, particularly with the reforms under Kofi Annan?
On African faring better in the UN, if you look at the UN Security Council, even in terms of allocation of resources on peace and security, Africa was getting almost 2/3. That is because of the many conflicts which Ambassador Boaz has referred to that were in the continent, which means during his tenure, he was able then to secure all these budgets, of course, through the Security Council, and of course that is a preserve of the Security Council. But of course, the UN Secretary General has a big role to play on that. Did he leave the UN better off in some of the areas, particularly on the reforms? I would say no, because Africa has all along fought for equity, because Africa is the only continent that is not represented in the UN Security Council. And Africa has been fighting and pushing for that, at least one seat, and not just the seat, but also with a veto, because it is a continent like another continent, but it's the only continent that is not represented. Kofi Annan worked with African leaders to secure that position. Of course, as again it's been said, that is again stemming in the way the UN was set up with these veto powers that is so difficult to change.
Right. Very briefly, as we wind up, how do you think the world, and particularly Africa, will be remembering Kofi Annan? Because his mission after he left the United Nations, went beyond peace and security. It went to, AIDS issues. It went to Africa's empowering in terms of agriculture. How do you think the world is going to remember him, particularly the continent?
As a Secretary General that brought Africa closer to many countries, because he was able to talk peace, talk development, talk humanitarian assistance, and also talk about equity in a manner it hadn't been articulated before. But also as a person that faced many challenges. Remember, he faced the challenge, for instance, invasion of Iraq, which was very difficult. He had been through with Bosnia. And it is during his time that we had this new phenomenon of terrorism. But of course, he was able to bring together the UN family to be able to articulate a common position and a common front to work together. Right. So he's also one that brought the UN for a common purpose.
Right, Ambassador Mbaya, you have the final word.
Africa should be proud to have produced Kofi Annan as one of his greatest sons. And his intellect, his patience, his statesmanship stand out. Kofi Annan was consulted beyond being the United Nations Secretary General. And even after he left office, the rest of the world, the whole world, was consulting Kofi Annan on specific issues, whether they were development, whether they were peace, whether there were conflicts. He was being consulted a lot. And I think we shall miss that contribution by Kofi Annan.
Right, Ambassador Mbaya and Erastus Mwencha, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. Thank you for joining us on the program. And thank you to my guests, Ambassador Erastus Mwencha, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, and Ambassador Boaz Mbaya, Kenya's former ambassador to the African Union. Do keep the conversation going online through our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And remember to tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.